The Georgia sun didn't just shine that day, it pressed down like a judgment. Thick, punishing, suffocating, and beneath it stood a 17-year-old girl named Celia, wrists still raw where the auction chains had rubbed skin into bright, stinging welts. She was small but wiry, the kind of strength you don't see until it erupts. And yet in that moment, she looked like a shadow of herself. Eyes lowered, body trembling, heart full of the kind of exhaustion that's older than any child should ever carry. Whitmore Plantation sprawled out before her like a warning. The main house rose white and polished against the summer sky, its columns gleaming like the bars of a cage pretending to be beautiful. Every slave on the place called it something different under their breath. The breaker, the pit, the last stop. They whispered its name the way people speak of storms coming over the horizon. And waiting for Celia on that veranda, framed by silk and poison sweetness, was Mistress Adelaide Whitmore. Adelaide was 32 but carried herself like she'd inherited centuries of entitlement. Pale blue dress, hair pinned into perfect coils that didn't dare fall out of place. Her fan moved lazily, but the eyes above it were sharp, assessing, hungry with a cruelty that didn't hide it preened. "So," Adelaide drawled as she descended the veranda steps, "this is what Patterson sent me? Scrawny thing, isn't she? We'll see if she's worth the price." Celia kept her gaze down, partly because she'd been trained to and partly because looking into Adelaide's face felt like stepping too close to a fire. The stories she'd heard on the 3-day journey, the whispers traded between slaves while traders barked commands, were already tightening around her throat. People warned her. Whitmore Plantation didn't just work you. It broke you from the inside out. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," Adelaide snapped. Celia lifted her eyes slowly. What she saw there froze her breath, not simple cruelty, but enjoyment. A woman who took pleasure in domination, in fear, in obedience. "You'll work in the house," Adelaide said, circling Celia like a collector judging quality. "But first, we have a tradition here, a way of making things clear from the start." She turned her head toward the barn. Mr. Dawson, Mr. Pike. 2 overseers stepped forward like shadows pulled loose from the woodwork. Dawson was built like a bull, angry red cheeks, sweat already staining his shirt, though it was barely morning. Pike, on the other hand, was lean with an unsettling stillness. His face was the kind that looked carved from something hard, not angry, not kind, just resigned to whatever he'd been shaped into. "Show our new girl how we welcome arrivals," Adelaide said softly. There was something in that softness that made Celia's stomach turn. It wasn't threat. It was ritual. Dawson grabbed Celia's left arm. Pike grabbed the right. Their hands were practiced. Too practiced. They'd done this before. Many times. "Take her to the quarters," Adelaide said, snapping her fan shut. "Make sure everyone hears. I want them reminded of what happens when anyone forgets their place." Celia's pulse hammered. Her vision swam. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to run. The plantation stretched for miles in every direction, patrolled, watched, fenced by geography and power. But something else rose up inside her too, a pressure she'd been holding since Virginia, since the auction block, since the last glimpse of her mother's face fading in the crowd. It was disbelief, rage, a refusal, or maybe just the last thin thread of herself refusing to snap quietly. As Dawson and Pike began to drag her forward, something inside Celia broke, not the kind of breaking that ends a person. The other kind, the sharp kind, the kind that turns fear into fire. She went limp, her whole body sagged into dead weight. Pike's grip slipped for just an instant. That instant was enough. Celia surged sideways, wrenching herself free with a burst of strength no one expected. Dawson swore, stumbling. Pike lunged but caught only empty air, and Celia didn't run away from the house. She ran straight toward it, straight toward Adelaide. Her feet hit the veranda steps with the force of a storm breaking open. Adelaide's eyes widened, not in anger, but in pure, stunned confusion. Her fan dropped, clattering against the wood. "What?" "Stop her." Too late. Celia grabbed Adelaide's wrists, the mistress's delicate, manicured wrists, and held them with a strength that made Adelaide gasp. The two women locked eyes. The world seemed to still. In Adelaide's gaze, Celia saw disbelief. In Celia's gaze, Adelaide saw something she'd never seen from a slave before. A complete absence of fear. "You want to teach me about this place?" Celia said, voice low and steady. "Let me teach you something instead." Footsteps thundered up the steps, Dawson and Pike scrambling. Shocked house servants frozen in the doorway. Field hands looking on in disbelief from the yard. A slave girl was touching the mistress, and Adelaide Whitmore was too stunned to scream. Celia shoved Adelaide backward, dragging her through the grand doorway, into the kitchen, into the heat of the cook fire still burning from the midday meal. House slaves pressed against the walls like figures carved from fear. "Celia, don't," someone whispered. "They'll kill you." Celia didn't seem to hear. Her eyes were fixed on Adelaide, who was trembling for the first time in her life. Near the hearth rested a fireplace poker. Its end glowed red, alive with heat. Celia grabbed it. The room inhaled. Adelaide inhaled. The glowing metal hissed faintly in the air between them. "Open your mouth," Celia said quietly. Adelaide's face drained of blood. You can't." The kitchen door burst open. Dawson and Pike froze at the sight. The glowing poker, Adelaide's wrists locked in Celia's grip. The mistress, staring into the face of a girl she'd thought beneath her. "Come closer," Celia said, raising the poker. "And I'll do it anyway. Do you think I care what happens to me now?" Pike lifted a hand slowly, voice strained. "Girl, just put that down. You don't want to do this, don't I?" Celia asked. "Your mistress was about to have you drag me off and do God knows what. She smiles when she orders it. She enjoys it." Adelaide began to cry. The kind of tears that come from real fear, not sorrow, not shame. Fear. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't." Celia's voice hardened. "Did you say please to the others?" Silence. The fire crackled. Sweat dripped down Celia's forehead. The poker shimmered, and then came Thomas Whitmore's voice, booming from outside. "Adelaide, what in God's name is happening in there?" The moment snapped. Pike lunged. He grabbed Celia's arm. She jerked sideways, but not fast enough. The poker swung wild, too wild to aim. Its glowing end brushed Adelaide's shoulder, burning through silk and skin. The mistress screamed. A terrible, animal sound. Dawson tackled Celia, driving her into the floor. The poker clattered away. "What have you done?" Thomas roared, as he burst in with more overseers. "What she deserved." Celia gasped, blood filling her mouth. Thomas backhanded her so hard the world spun. "Chain her up. I'll deal with her after the doctor tends to Adelaide." They dragged Celia out the back, past slaves who stared with an expression she didn't expect. Not terror. Something else. Hope. In the barn, they chained her to a support beam, arms stretched painfully overhead until her feet barely touched the ground. Within minutes, her shoulders throbbed like tearing rope. Pike lingered after Dawson left. "You know what's coming," he said quietly. "Master Thomas is going to make an example of you." Celia met his eyes. "I know. Was it worth it?" he asked. "Those few seconds?" Celia didn't hesitate. "Yes." Pike's jaw clenched. A flicker of something human passed through his eyes. "For what it's worth," he murmured at the doorway. "I had a sister once. Lost her to the trade. I hope she had half your fire." Then he was gone. The afternoon dimmed into evening. The barn filled with long shadows. Celia's arms went numb, then burned, then numb again. Someone slipped inside Ruth, the cook, small and worn by years of surviving cruelty. "Don't make noise," she whispered, bringing water to Celia's lips. "Drink slow." Celia drank like someone swallowing the last kindness on earth. "They saying Master Thomas will whip you near to death tomorrow," Ruth whispered, "then sell whatever's left of you down south." "I figured," Celia rasped. Ruth wiped the blood from her lip with shaking hands. "Child, what possessed you?" "One moment of standing up," Celia said, "is worth more than a lifetime of staying down." Ruth looked at her like she'd seen a miracle and a tragedy at once. Before she could answer, Pike appeared again at the door, lantern in hand. "Ruth, go," he said. "Thomas is up. He sees you here. He'll think you're part of all this." Ruth squeezed Celia's hand before slipping out. Pike lingered. "People are talking," he said. "What you did. Folks saw it. Folks heard. That kind of thing spreads." Celia felt a pulse of something deep inside, not triumph, but purpose. "Good," she whispered. Pike nodded once, quietly, almost respectfully. Then he closed the door. The night pressed in around her. Pain radiated through her arms, across her back, into her ribs. She thought of her mother. She thought of Adelaide begging. She thought of everyone who saw it. And she knew whatever happened tomorrow, she had already cracked something open, something that wouldn't close again. Dawn didn't arrive gently on Whitmore Plantation. It spilled in harsh and golden, lighting the yard with that same unforgiving brilliance that exposed everything. Cruelty, fear, defiance, hope. Celia woke to the sound of footsteps. The ache in her arms so deep it felt like it lived inside her bones now. The barn slats glowed with the rising sun, and for a moment she felt suspended between worlds, not alive, not dead, but something stubbornly clinging to both. The door creaked open. Thomas Whitmore stood silhouetted against the blinding light. Behind him were Dawson, already rolling his shoulders like a man preparing for sport, and James Whitmore, whose face carried a different kind of suffering, not kindness, but conflict. "Cut her down," Thomas ordered. Dawson unlocked the chains. Celia's body collapsed instantly, the ground rushing up to meet her. The first touch of earth was both a relief and a new agony. Blood surged back into her arms in white-hot waves that made her vision blur. "Get her up." Dawson hauled her to her feet. Celia's legs buckled, but two field overseers grabbed her under the arms and dragged her forward. She didn't resist, not because she was broken, but because she understood something no whip could destroy. She had already done the thing that couldn't be undone, the thing that would echo. She crossed the yard, past the slave quarters, past the people who had gathered in muted silence. Mothers held their children close. Old men stood with hands clenched behind their backs. Young men watched with fire banked behind their eyes. Every one of them knew they were witnessing a sentence. At the center of the yard stood the whipping post. The wood was smooth from years of bodies tied against it. Celia's stomach twisted at the sight, but her face remained still. They stretched her arms above her head again, tying her wrists tight enough that the rope bit into already torn skin. She exhaled slowly, letting her gaze travel the crowd. She recognized faces she barely knew. People who had whispered warnings on her first day. She saw Ruth, standing near the back, tears tracking down her cheeks. And she saw something else in those faces. Not pity, recognition. Thomas Whitmore stepped forward, the leather of his boots gleaming. His voice carried across the yard, authoritative and cold. "This girl came to Whitmore Plantation yesterday," he began. "In less than a day, she attacked my wife, causing injury and disgrace. Such actions cannot and will not be tolerated." Celia kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. She wouldn't look at him, wouldn't give him the dignity of her attention. 50 lashes, Thomas declared. Gasps rippled through the crowd. 50 was not punishment. 50 was attempted murder. Dawson stepped forward, uncoiling his whip with a dry, slithering sound that seemed to cut the air itself. He was grinning, not wide, not theatrical, just a small, satisfied twist of the mouth that said he'd done this before, that he liked it. Celia inhaled through her nose. The morning air was cool, almost kind, and she clung to that sensation as the last soft thing she'd feel for some time. The first lash hit her back like fire. She staggered, breath catching in her throat, but she didn't scream. She forced the sound back inside. She would not scream. The second lash came quick, the third quicker. Each one landed with a crack that sliced through the yard. Children flinched. Men ground their teeth. Women closed their eyes. By the 10th lash, her back burned like a field set alight. Her skin felt flayed. Her knees trembled. Still, she didn't scream. By the 20th, she could taste blood her own, from biting the inside of her cheek so hard she felt something tear. Dawson paused to adjust his grip, sweat beading on his forehead. He glanced at Thomas for permission to continue. Thomas nodded. The whip rose again. Stop. The word dropped into the yard like a stone thrown into still water. Every head turned. Adelaide Whitmore descended the steps of the veranda, her movements stiff, her right shoulder wrapped tightly beneath a shawl. Her skin was pale, her expression unreadable, but her voice carried the same way her cruelty once had. "That's enough, Thomas." Her husband stared at her, incredulous. "Adelaide, the punishment was 50, I said," she repeated. "That's enough." Dawson hesitated, the whip hanging in midair, suspended between violence and command. Adelaide walked across the yard. Even wounded, she moved with purpose, not the performative elegance she usually carried, but something rawer, something altered. She stopped a few feet from Celia. "Everyone here," she said softly, "has seen what happens when someone defies us. The point has been made." Thomas's jaw tightened. "She attacked you. She scarred you." Adelaide's expression flashed with something not shame, not rage, something quieter, something that looked almost haunted. "Yes," she said, "and I want her to live with what she's done. I want her to carry these scars, and I want everyone here to remember." She stepped closer to Celia, lowering her voice until only Celia could hear. "I need to remember too." Celia lifted her head, meeting Adelaide's gaze through the haze of agony. "I need to remember," Adelaide whispered, "that someone I believed beneath me made me beg, that I am not untouchable, that fear is not something I am above." She swallowed hard. "That is punishment enough." Adelaide straightened, turning toward the watching crowd. "Cut her down," she ordered. "Give her to Ruth to tend. She will work in the house when she's healed." A stunned wave swept over the slaves. Thomas looked as though someone had struck him. "You're keeping her here?" he demanded. "She stays," Adelaide said. Her voice carried a strange certainty, a conviction Thomas couldn't argue with. "Under my roof, where I can see her, every day." There was something deeply unsettling in that. Not compassion, not forgiveness, something far more complicated. "She stays," Adelaide repeated. Dawson, deflated but obedient, cut Celia down. Her legs collapsed beneath her. Ruth and another woman rushed forward, catching her before she hit the ground. As they carried her away, Celia saw the crowd one last time, faces bewildered, afraid, but also brightened by something simmering beneath the shock. Hope, not blind hope, not foolish hope, but the kind that takes root in the soil where terror used to grow. Celia drifted in and out of consciousness as Ruth and the other women tended her wounds. They worked with herbs, cloths soaked in cool water, whispered prayer. Her back throbbed with each breath, each heartbeat. Fever came and went in waves so heavy she felt like she was drowning in her own skin. Ruth stayed by her side the longest. "You're alive," she murmured one night, brushing damp hair from Celia's forehead. "Lord above, girl. I did not expect that. Thought you'd be gone by noon." Celia's voice was thin. "Why? Did she stop it?" Ruth hesitated. "Fear changes a person. Sometimes for worse, sometimes for strange reasons." Celia let the room drift again. Days passed, or maybe weeks, time blurred together, marked only by the rhythm of pain and cooling compresses and the low murmur of voices in the quarters. One afternoon, Pike stood in the doorway. "You're tougher than I thought," he said, hat in his hands. "Didn't think you'd make it through the night." Celia managed a dry laugh. "Disappointed?" "No." He shook his head. "No, I'm just surprised." He shifted awkwardly, then added, "Your name's traveling. Stories spreading. Other plantations heard already." Celia turned her head slightly, wincing. "Good." Pike almost smiled. "Good," he echoed. He left without another word, but the weight of his presence lingered a man, rethinking the shape of the world he lived in. As Celia healed, the plantation changed in small but visible ways. Adelaide no longer barked orders with thoughtless cruelty. She still carried authority, but something in her had fractured. Sometimes, she paused mid-command, hand drifting involuntarily to the hidden scar beneath her dress. She avoided Celia at first, passing her in hallways with quick, unsettled glances. The slaves noticed. The overseers noticed. Even Thomas noticed, though he pretended otherwise. Rumors grew like roots in dark soil. People whispered that Celia had burned the mistress alive, that she'd possessed supernatural strength, that she'd forced Adelaide to kneel, that she'd stared death in the eye and didn't blink. The details changed with each retelling, but the core stayed the same. A slave had made the mistress beg. A mistress had been afraid, and the world, however small, however brutal, had shifted. Weeks later, Celia was strong enough to stand, to walk, to work in the house again. Her back ached constantly, skin tight where scars pulled against her movements, but she carried herself with an unbroken spine. One afternoon, as she carried linens up the staircase, Adelaide descended it. They froze. For a moment, nothing existed but the memory of fire between them. Adelaide's hand rose unconsciously to her shoulder. "The linens go in the closet at the end of the hall," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am." Celia stepped aside, but Adelaide didn't move. Instead, she studied Celia's face, not with hatred, not with anger, but with a kind of reluctant understanding. "I think about that day," Adelaide murmured. "Every day." Celia remained silent. "I remembered fear," Adelaide continued. "A fear I didn't know I could feel. A fear some people feel every day." A long pause stretched between them. "Does it change anything?" Celia asked. Adelaide breathed out slowly. "The system is the same," she said, "but I am not." Then she stepped past Celia and continued down the stairs. Celia stood there for a long while, her heart pounding in a way the whip never managed to provoke. Because for the first time since she'd arrived on Whitmore Plantation, she saw something impossible. Adelaide Whitmore had been changed by her. Not enough to break the system, but enough to crack it. And sometimes a crack is all a revolution needs. 3 months passed before Celia was strong enough to move like herself again. Her back would always bear the scars raised, uneven, permanent reminders of the price she'd paid, but her body had learned to carry them. The house slaves watched her move through the main hallways with a mixture of awe and caution, as though she were some kind of living omen. In a way, she was. Every time Celia entered a room, conversations stilled. People straightened. Overseers avoided looking her directly in the eyes, not because she frightened them physically, but because she reminded them of something the entire slave-holding world depended on forgetting. She reminded them that none of this was guaranteed, and that frightened people more deeply than any weapon. Work in the main house began quietly. Ruth kept an eye on Celia as she eased into her new tasks, carrying laundry, sweeping, mending, assisting with kitchen duties when the heat wasn't too much for her scarred back. Ruth had a way of orbiting Celia without making it obvious. Sometimes, as Celia moved between rooms, she'd catch the older woman watching her with a look that was half protectiveness, half grief. "You turned the whole place upside down," Ruth whispered one evening, helping Celia fold linens. "Even if nobody says it aloud." "I didn't mean to," Celia replied. Ruth shook her head. "Meaning ain't always part of a thing. Sometimes God snatches a girl up and drops her where he needs the fire to burn." Celia didn't believe that. But she didn't argue. Whitmore Plantation shifted like a slow-moving tide. Adelaide no longer barked orders with gleeful cruelty. Instead, she spoke quietly, her voice calm, her gaze distant as though she were always thinking about something that had never once crossed her mind before that day in the kitchen. Fear. Not fear of Celia specifically, though, that lingered beneath Adelaide's refinement like a bruise, but fear of the system she'd upheld her whole life. Fear of what it made her capable of. Fear of what it had already turned her into. Thomas hated the change. He paced more, shouted more, started dinners later, but he could not undo the shift in his wife, and the slaves could sense it that Adelaide's certainty had been dismantled by a single moment, by a single girl holding a poker that glowed with the heat of every injustice. Celia had not only marked Adelaide's shoulder, she had marked her mind, and the mind is where systems first begin to crack. One afternoon, while carrying freshly washed linens up the main staircase, Celia reached the top just as Adelaide descended. The two stopped inches apart. It struck Celia that this was the closest they had been since that day. Since the kitchen, the poker, the begging. Adelaide's hand lifted instinctively to her shoulder, fingers brushing the area where the burn had healed into a raised, pale scar beneath the fabric. "Those go in the hall closet," Adelaide said softly. "Yes, ma'am." Celia stepped to move around her, but Adelaide didn't pass. Instead, she studied Celia as though seeing her for the first time, not as property, not as threat, but as something entirely outside the categories her world had given her. "I've thought about that day," Adelaide murmured. "Every single day." Celia kept her voice even. "You said that before." "Yes," Adelaide said, eyes tightening. "But I need you to understand how true it is. I had built my life on the belief that I was above fear, above consequences, that my comfort was a God-given order." She paused, "and then you stripped that away in a single moment." Celia didn't flinch. "You still own me, ma'am. Nothing much has changed." Adelaide inhaled sharply. "The system is unchanged. That is true. But I am not. And I cannot forget what I learned that day. About myself. About all of this." She gestured faintly around them, the house, the land, the silent power woven into every brick. Celia looked her in the eyes. "Then what do you plan to do with that knowing?" Adelaide didn't answer. She stepped past Celia and descended the stairs like a woman walking with two burdens, a scar on her shoulder and another one inside her. That evening, in the quarters, Ruth pulled Celia aside. "There's been word," she whispered. "Stories about you spreading from plantation to plantation." Celia frowned. "Stories?" Ruth nodded. "Everywhere. Folks say a girl at Whitmore made the mistress beg, made her scream, made her run scared. Folks telling each other the tale in Virginia, in South Carolina. Even heard there's talk in Louisiana now." Celia's breath caught. "It's just a story. It ain't just anything," Ruth said. "Stories are the only thing that travel free." Celia sat with that for a long moment. She thought of her mother, the auction block, the way their hands had been torn apart. She wondered if her mother had heard the stories, if she'd know the girl in them was her daughter, if she'd be proud, or frightened, or both. There were ripples across Whitmore. Small ones, quiet ones, but real. Field hands slowed their work on certain days. Tools broke mysteriously. Overseers found themselves outnumbered by eyes watching, waiting, calculating. Not an uprising, but not submission either. The tension felt like a storm building far off, too distant to see, too certain to stop. Pike approached Celia one morning while she scrubbed the kitchen floor. "You started something," he said quietly. Celia didn't look up. "I didn't start anything. I acted. That's what starts things," he replied. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. He looked older than she remembered, or maybe the shift inside him just made him appear that way. "Other plantations heard," Pike said. "Masters are jumpy. Overseers nervous. Lot of folks think. This is the first spark." Celia wiped her hands on her skirt. "A spark isn't a fire." "No," Pike said. "But it's where fires come from." He left after that, but she could feel the truth of his words settle around her like dust. Years passed. The plantation evolved in small, painfully slow increments. Adelaide grew thinner, quieter, less cruel. She took to long walks alone. Sometimes Celia would see her pause in the yard, hand on her shoulder, head bowed. Thomas aged into bitterness. James took over much of the plantation's operations, and while he wasn't gentle, he wasn't monstrous either. He treated the enslaved with a distant, emotionless efficiency rather than a desire to punish. Then came the winter. Adelaide fell ill. Consumption took her slowly, stealing her voice. Then, her strength. She died with her family around her and with a strange, heavy expression on her face, as though she had lived long enough to regret her own creation. In her final weeks, she freed 3 of her house slaves, including Ruth. Ruth wept when she told Celia. "It ain't enough," she said. "Not for all she did. But it's something." Celia nodded, though a tightness gripped her chest. Something. The word felt too small and too large at once. One evening, when the sky was purple with dusk, Celia found herself alone in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she had held the poker, where Adelaide had begged, where everything had shifted. She ran her fingers along the stone near the hearth. The fireplace poker hanging there now was new, but she remembered the old one perfectly, its weight, the heat radiating through her hand, the choice she'd made. She heard footsteps behind her. Pike stood in the doorway, gray, thinning hair pulled back, face lined with the years. "Thinking about that day?" he asked. "Always," Celia admitted. He nodded. "You change things. Not everything. Not enough. But things." Celia didn't respond. Pike continued, voice low. "I heard the stories. Folks tell them far from here. Kids grow up hearing about the girl who made Adelaide Whitmore beg. Some say it gave them courage when they needed it." Celia swallowed. "It didn't free anybody." "Maybe not," Pike said. "But you didn't let them forget that the ones with power can bleed. That matters. More than you know." He left her standing in the warmth of the dying firelight, your ghost of a threat still lingering in that room. Night settled over the plantation. Celia stepped outside into the cooling air, the sky washed with stars. The fields were quiet, but the quiet no longer felt like surrender. She touched the scar beneath her dress, the one that still tightened when she lifted her arms too high, the one that reminded her of the stake, the whip, the day she didn't bend. She wasn't free. Not in body, but she had never been more free in spirit. Somewhere out there, someone was telling her story. Someone was hearing it. Someone was deciding whether to bow or to stand. Revolutions didn't always begin with armies. Sometimes they began with a girl holding a poker, a girl who refused fear, a girl who showed the world what could break. Celia walked forward into the dark, her silhouette small against the vastness, but her presence unmistakable. The embers she had created still glowed, and one day, enough embers would gather to burn the whole system down.